What's going on, y'all? I'm KMBest. Let's talk about the best decks in Marvel Snap. There's no other deck that we could start with here. Loki is the meta. He is the thing that everything else revolves around, and I currently believe that he is the best deck in the game. I've recently been experimenting with using only 3 card generators, which Snowguard is a pretty key piece of, so if you don't have Snowguard, you're going to want to replace both her and something else with a card generator. I think you can only go down to 3 card generators if you have both Snowguard and Agent Coulson. Those are the ones that give you 2 cards, which is pretty important to your Loki game plan. Now, the way this deck wins is quite simply by doing unfair things. Your best plays are almost always something like Collector into Agent Coulson, into Snowguard plus Loki on 4, and that will make a gigantic collector and give you 7 cards in your hand, all of which are discounted by 1 from the Loki. It's just not very fair. A lot of people seem to think that, like wave stuff beats this. The secret to beating wave stuff with this deck is you just Loki on 4 and then play a bunch of cards on 5, and then you're way too far ahead for them to ever come back, even when they wave, because wave is a big tempo loss for them. It's a 3 power card. That's just not very good. Now, the real things that tend to beat this deck, Cerebro 3, Hela Tribunal, they can kind of fall apart because they are what they are. But I have included a Cosmo as a nod to those matchups. It's a little bit better against Hela Tribunal. Of course, the Invisible Woman stuff. You can absolutely scam them out of any Invisible Woman MODOK Hela plan. But, it also does some other stuff like, stopping a Shadow King, stopping a Valkyrie. Those are the main methods for Cerebro 3 to attack you. And it's generally also good about destroy decks trying to go over the top. You can stop a Deadpool from getting blown up. A lot of powerful things Cosmo does in this game, and I think right now it would be a mistake to play Loki without Cosmo, given how other people are trying to attack you. The rest of the deck is pretty straightforward. Angela's back in just because we got to shave off a card generator, which allowed us to put Jeff back in. Now we have Jeff, Angela, Kitty. So Angela gets a little bit better because we have the Jeff in addition to the Kitty for extra Angela procs. And that lets us be a little bit more flexible in terms of game plan, because Cosmo often is a card you're going to want to keep. You end up not using Loki all the time with this deck. It's just a very, very solid thing that you can do. And in certain matchups, you're going to want to keep your mid-range game plan with a Cosmo and some other things a more viable option. Next up is High Evo Wave. A lot of people like to say that this deck beats Loki. It doesn't, not unless the Loki player is really messing up somewhere. But what it does do is beat a lot of the things that are trying to beat Loki, and it doesn't automatically lose to Loki. I would guess that this has an unfavored matchup into Loki, but it's not a super unfavored matchup into Loki. It does not get rolled the way a lot of the other fair mid-range decks do. It is very often able to play for a 50-50 with a gigantic Hulk, and that is good enough to make it my premier wave deck for right now. There are other solid wave decks, I like Move Wave a fair bit, with Kraven and Silk and all that. But I think this one is a little bit better positioned in terms of just being able to brute force games to a 50-50. Now, do keep in mind, don't always wave. There are some games where you're just going to die anyway, even if you wave, because the Loki deck will Loki you on 4 and then just play a bunch of big stuff. And yeah, you're not exactly favored there, but you have a plan, which to me puts you a little bit above some of the other options. Cerebro 3 is a deck I never expected to even talk about being on this list. I had absolutely no expectations of this deck ever making it to any tier list I ever talked about, but it is pretty solid. There's a lot of decks where Valkyrie is very, very powerful. A lot of the control tools that this deck has have basically never been better in the history of Marvel Snap. And right now, if you wanted to be a Cerebro gamer, you could do it. I do believe that if you want to purely beat up Loki, this is likely your best choice. Even with Cosmo in the Loki deck, as long as they're not running Luke Cage, you should be able to figure out a way to win. I do feel like, as someone who's been playing a lot of Loki, this is likely my worst matchup. One of the few that is, I think, actually bad and not just a 50-50. I do think Cerebro 3 is a little bit favored into Loki. It, of course, has the weakness of being Cerebro 3, but you kind of just have to deal with it. But if you really want to beat Loki, I do think this is where I would be at. Now, speaking of decks that are like kind of 50-50 against Loki, that like have actual plans outside of that matchup, Sauron Shuri is probably the #1 option in terms of like, okay, I don't want to automatically lose to Loki, but I also want to have an actual game plan, right? You don't want to sell out entirely, go play Cerebro 3 or whatever in order to just beat Loki and then get farmed by everything else. This allows you to have a reasonable matchup into Loki, probably pretty close to 50-50 in my experience, but also, and this is crucial, have a game plan in other matchups that is generally strong. Shang-Chi has never been played less than he is being played right now, and Shuri is perfectly set up to take advantage of that with brute force. A lot of good players will say, oh man, I hate playing this deck because it is very, very boring, but that low skill floor means that a lot of players who are watching this video, more than want to admit it, I think, could benefit from playing this. My thesis has always been, if there are 2 decks that will get you roughly equal results when played optimally, but one of them is a lot easier to play, you're almost always supposed to play the easy one. This deck is that deck. Next up is Magik Evo, and this deck benefits a lot from being one of 2 high Evo decks. You can't actually tell which one you're playing for a while, and I do think that if everyone sort of coalesces on one of these 2 decks, it can become a lot harder for either of them to win, because I know, as someone who's been playing a lot of Loki, until I know whether I have to play around Wave or Leech or God knows what else, until I know that, I don't know how to play around it. And on ladder, you can take advantage of that, because like if I see, you know, Sunspot, Nebula, a couple passes and an armor, I still don't know what you are until you have gotten me with it. And I think this deck benefits pretty strongly from that. You should think about it when you play this list. And of course, it is just sort of a fundamentally strong list. Like passing your turn 6 into a She-Hulk and an Infinite is a lot of points. Giving your opponent some cards they can't play after a Loki, like a bunch of middling 1-drops, is very, very strong. That said, you do have to be really aware of how good Lokis can get off of you. Like, I have seen some ridiculous stuff come out of a Loki, and as the Loki player, I have once had a turn 7 that involved playing Hulk, She-Hulk, and the Infinite, all from my opponent's deck. It was not pretty. Shout out to Titan. Another deck I never thought would be here, ever, is Hela Tribunal. This list was built by Revis, and I won't go so far as to say I'm a believer, but it is one of the few decks, along with Cerebro 3, that I think is actively good into Loki. Now, with more Loki players playing Cosmo, you are likely not going to be able to rely on Invisible Woman, MODOK, Hela as much as you would want. And that is kind of an issue because you don't know if they're playing Cosmo until they Cosmo your shit for 8 cubes. And that's bad. But I do think that this deck maybe doesn't necessarily have legs. It's not going to stick around for a long period of time. But right now, there's not a lot of answers to it. And if you snap and retreat smartly with it, you should legitimately be able to climb. Now, this is important, though. Snapping and retreating smartly means you need to be able to evaluate your hand, what your chances of drawing your things are, and whether or not you think that will win you the game at every stage. Because if someone snaps you and you aren't getting that value back, that will inevitably drag you ever further downward. Please understand that it is not just a deck where you can be like, I'll stay in and see what happens. It's a deck where you need to be like, okay, well, if X, Y, and Z happen, and they have a 62.5% chance of happening, then I'm going to win, so I'm staying in because of that. Like, there's a lot of future sight involved here in terms of like, all right, well, if I Jubilee here onto this Kamartage, I have a couple of shots at getting a Hela, and that is enough for me to stay in the game. Like, there's a lot of that here, and you have to be, fundamentally, you have to be willing to gamble if you want to play this. Our first honorable mention goes to a deck posted by second dinner developer Glenn Jones. And this deck is basically all about that turn 6 explosion. You absolutely get creamed if you get waved and you are not aware of the wave, but it's sort of like bounceless bounce here, where you have Thor into Mjolnir, you have Wasp, you have Yellow Jacket, All of those pump a Hitmonkey. The Hitmonkey gets even bigger off of the Mysterio. You have Angela, you have Bishop. It's bounce, right? Like, it's just bounce. You want to play like, you go like Bishop into Thor, into Jane, into 8 million cards, and that's what your game plan is. Allocating your points is going to be a test of your ability to read where your opponent's points are going, but there is enough air in this deck that when you're playing against a Loki deck, sometimes they'll just get like complete crap. As a Loki player, it's kind of just if I get a Hitmonkey that I feel like I'm in this game, the rest of the time it's very much a 50-50, and where the power goes matters a lot. Discard is another honorable mention here. And I think a lot of people think, okay, discard, it's going to be good because it's kind of a synergy-driven deck. So when Loki gets the stuff, it's not very good. But yeah, Loki's actually pretty able to, like, mimic your game plan a fair bit. And they're already pretty good at points, and you're really only competing on points. So it's honestly a little bit tougher of a matchup than you might think. But it is one of the decks that, like, I don't hate playing into Loki. I don't love it, but I don't hate it. And that goes a long way. It's enough for it to be an honorable mention here. If you're looking for a simple deck, like with the Sauron Shuri list, I think this one is a very good one. I don't necessarily think it's as good as Sauron Shuri, but like, not everyone has all the cards for Sauron Shuri, and a lot of people have the cards for this. One thing to keep in mind is Blade's new text makes him very, very powerful here. Dakin, of course, always adds his thing to where Blade can immediately discard it. Anytime Apocalypse comes back into hand, he goes to where Blade can immediately discard him. There's a lot of thinking that needs to go into your sequencing here, but it's a deck that rewards you for mastering it. And fundamentally, like, there's only like 2 or 3 decisions you really have to make. Only Blade adds any complexity to this, and the rest of the deck is pretty simple. You're outputting a lot of power, hopefully in a way that is hard to interact with. The next honorable mention that I have is Move Wave. I talked about it a little bit in the High Evo Wave section. My impression is that the best thing you can do with Wave right now is High Evo. It's not great into Loki, but it's like great into basically everything else. This is a really good deck. I just don't think it's very good into Loki. It suffers from turn 4 Lokis way more than High Evo does. Like, High Evo does have the advantage over this deck in terms of not giving them a bunch of really good cards. But when Loki turn 4 Lokis you and you're playing this, they are getting 1/5s. They are getting so much good stuff off of you. And and to the point that, like, you playing Wave is almost entirely pointless. Like, it doesn't even work. You just get so out-tempoed that your own game plan just falls apart immediately. And I have seen some, additions. All right, like we play Jean Grey and then we play Eliath in here. And that way we force them into there. But I feel like a lot of the time they're just going to be so ahead everywhere that is not a reliable game plan. Like, they're just going to be so ahead so consistently that I don't even think that's going to work. Outside of the Loki matchup, though, I mean, this is a great deck. I want to be clear about that. Like, if Loki didn't exist, this would be one of the best decks in the game. I truly, honestly believe that. But Loki exists, and as soon as they know what you are, and they should be doing this most of the time, you get hosed by turn 4 Lokis. It's bad. All right, y'all, that's going to be it from me for today. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. Please remember, like, subscribe. Let me know in the comments if you think I missed anything. It's kind of early in the meta. I made this the day of Eliath release. I played a little Eliath and I was like, all right, I'm not seeing it with this card. So no Eliath decks on here right now. But I do think that obviously they need to give it some time for the card to impact the meta, for people to find out the best decks. Currently, I'm interested in Thanos Shell and in a Thanos Galactus Shell and in a normal Galactus Shell, basically always in concert with a turn 4 Professor X. That seems to be the thing that I want to do with Eliath the most, but I know other people have been playing around with it in the Move Wave Shell and various Wave mid-range shells. I don't really see it there, but I'm willing to give it the benefit of the doubt and say, like, if you want to play one of those, feel free to experiment. I just don't think I can recommend them at this time. As always, I really appreciate it. You have a good one. I will see you in the next one.